And before I get started, Alexandra or Kishore, folks, can you see my screen okay? Can you see my video and audio? Everything coming through okay?
Yes.
Everything's good? Okay. We'll take that as a yes. All right. Super excited about being here with you all, everybody. Now, what are we trying to do here, everyone? So when people ask about reusability in MuleSoft, I get this a lot. I'm a consultant, and I'm also a trainer, but for my consulting clients, I actually get interesting questions about reusability and how to actually achieve it, which is very interesting, right? So I do notice a few misconceptions about MuleSoft. Tell me how many of you, I'm just kind of curious, maybe a show of hands, or maybe you guys can give me some comments. Have you ever walked into a meeting or for your employer, or perhaps with a client if you're a consultant, and you start talking about MuleSoft, and it seems like the foregone conclusion in the room is that when you open the box, so to speak, for MuleSoft, you automatically get reusability in everything that you do. Do you guys ever experience that? This idea out there? So I mean, it's because I think the Salesforce and the MuleSoft salespeople, they do a really good job of selling their product, and they do a really good job of pushing the message of reusability for creating APIs and reusing them, right? So I've noticed that. For myself, I've noticed that there is an expectation out there that when you start using MuleSoft, reusability comes automatically. And that's not exactly the case. So what we wanted to talk about is actually how to achieve that reusability and go a little bit beyond just the conversation about API-led connectivity, which everybody is pretty well familiar with, I would suppose, right? But we're going to review that a little bit, but we're going to get into some of the more nuanced aspects of the application network and how to achieve greater reusability, okay? Now, I'm going to say that there is hardly any reusability without discoverability. And what I'm also noticing is that a lot of companies are having a tough time really adapting to this idea of API discoverability, and having a tough time adapting to this idea that it's okay to put as many people into any point platform to look at Exchange as they can, right? So they think that access to any point platform really should be limited only to MuleSoft specialists, and that's definitely not the case. So it's taking a little time for folks to achieve this idea that in order to achieve reusability, you also have to have discoverability. Anyway, what are we trying to prevent here? Trying to prevent MuleSoft budget disasters, and that comes in the form of unexpected costs in labor, time, and licenses. Now, that's due to a couple of things. It's talent scarcity and lack of training, I think, but I think MuleSoft offers some great options out there for training, and there's also some great groups out there like this one that you can gain a lot of information from. I know I have, right? And we'll talk about a little bit of each one of these items here in just a moment. But first of all, a little bit more about me. I'm Tim Hanline, so I'm a MuleSoft architect, also a trainer, and I'm the president of two companies actually: Paradigm, which is a consultancy, and Mule Learning, which is a training company. And it's a lot, there's a lot going on, as you can well imagine, but my background is very technical. So when I graduated college, wow, I'm going to date myself now, 1995, a computer science degree. I went right into very technical programming, and I think I stayed there a little too long, probably 12 years or something, right? And then went into team leadership and solution architecture, and then also into training. Now, of course, those roles made me get out of my shell. I used to be one of those guys that you would put in the back room and just, open the door every once in a while and throw in a donut or a pizza or something just to keep me placated. But definitely don't give me an audience, because I'm really awkward in front of an audience. At least that's the way it was. So, but anyway, thankfully got out of that a little bit, I hope. But that's a little bit about me. I'm actually based out of North Carolina. Here's some big news. I wanted to start off with this news. Now, for some of you, this news might be old, but nonetheless, I still think it's big news to talk about. And it's a few months old now, but nonetheless, I think you might find this interesting, especially if you haven't come across this yet. Everyone knows, well, maybe everybody knows, Gartner. Gartner is a market research firm that puts out a lot of information about a lot of different sectors of the economy, a lot of different markets, a lot of different verticals and so on. And Gartner, of course, does write-ups on the API management market space. And I got really excited when I saw something, and I think maybe you'll get excited about it too. In 2019, Gartner put out a Magic Quadrant for API management, just like they do every year for the past few years. And MuleSoft in 2019 was placed really, really well. Now, if you know anything about the Magic Quadrant, you know that you want to be in the upper right-hand corner of the Magic Quadrant. You want to be in the leaders quadrant, right? And so there's a lot of players in this market, as you can see. But look at how MuleSoft is positioned, right? They are, according to Gartner now, the best when it comes to completeness of vision for API management. And they're second only to Google and Apogee in their ability to execute. But notice now what's happened in 2020. MuleSoft takes a huge jump up and puts it now on par with Apogee as far as its ability to execute, and it has an edge on its completeness of vision. Now, what does this tell me? Like it probably tells you, is that MuleSoft is still an escalator going up, and it looks like it's going to be that way for some time. So our friends at MuleSoft are really doing a great job putting their product together and marketing it and selling it, and we'll talk about the quality. But that's all good too, right? But anyway, doing a great job. So I'm really excited about MuleSoft, and I've been involved with MuleSoft since 2015. And what's interesting about that is I got involved immediately as a trainer, so had to learn the product pretty well. It was a lot of fun. So great stuff. Anyway, there you go. I'm excited about this. Maybe you are too. Fun stuff. Okay, now let's talk about reusability. I promised you some tips on reusability. But I've got to tell you about a little story. Maybe I can break the ice this way. As a consultant, I have quite a few clients, and one of my clients recently came to me with this question. He said, "Tim, we've had MuleSoft for over a year now, and we've delivered quite a few data integration solutions using MuleSoft. But Tim, where's my reusability?" And so I had to go now on a quest to find out what happened with this project to understand, why he's not achieving that kind of reusability and what's really happening. And so what I'd like to do is share some of my findings with you. Now, thankfully, I'm glad to report I shared my findings with them, and now they're right on course with where they should be and what they're expecting to be with reusability. But now there is more to reusability than what I'm about to explain, but I think these might give you some help as well, just in case you and your organization are struggling with how to achieve that reusability, right? So you probably have created APIs and data integrations, but you're not seeing as much reusability as you'd like to. And before I get into this, I'm going to talk about one thing that I think that is one of the keys, and I alluded to it just a moment ago, and I'm going to give you a little list of things that we're going to talk about. But one of the things I am going to talk about, just to set the stage here, is an idea called discoverability. Because, let's face it, nobody can reuse what you've done unless they know about it, right? In other words, nobody can consume the APIs that you've written unless they are aware of them. And the key there is discoverability, and everybody knows, I think, that in any point platform, the key to discoverability is making sure that the API is registered in any point platform exchange, and then making sure that any point platform exchange has a very broad audience, so that those in your organization, when they go looking for data, they are conditioned, I'd say, to think, well, in order to find the data that I need for my projects, I'm going to have to go to any point platform and go to Exchange. Now, if you can achieve that in an organization, I think you've done an extraordinary thing. But shy of that, I think what's going to happen is organizations are going to struggle with their reusability, okay? So I just want to put that out there. First thing, I've got some other helpful hints for you. how to achieve reusability, and it really starts with discoverability. So let me just kind of set the stage with that little nugget of info. Okay, all right, but let's talk about some other things here as well. So I'm going to talk about Java and MuleSoft. How much Java do you put in your MuleSoft projects? Training, system APIs, and process APIs. So I want to talk about each one of these topics in pretty much in a lot of detail here. But first, let's talk about system APIs. I'm going to start sort of the middle of the list. Is there a special technique to designing the interfaces for our system APIs in order to achieve maximum reusability? And I'm sure you'd be glad to know the answer is yes. And so here's going to be my answer, right? So what we want to do with system APIs to achieve the most reusability is a few things. One, we want to abstract the system's idiosyncrasies. So a system API is meant to be an interface for some backend system, whether that's an ERP system, a database system. You want to make sure that you're hiding that system's complexities. There's no need to expose those complexities to any of the developers that are going to consume that system API. What you want to do is hide those complexities as much as you can. And so to do that, what you want to do is get rid of every system-specific property and just focus on serving up one thing, and that's business data. And I want to make an example of this in just a moment, but if you serve up just the business data, preferably even in canonical format, you're going to go a long ways towards achieving reusability and also interchangeability. Okay, let's just say that you want to switch backend systems out with another backend system or a new system, but you want to be able to manage and serve up the same data. Well, if your system APIs are serving up business data, hiding all the idiosyncrasies and complexities of that backend system, then it will make interchanging your backend systems a little easier. And I'm never going to say that it's a simple chore. It's not, but it simply will make it. It certainly would make it easier. Okay. Now, I just gave you, I think, a golden nugget of information with regards to system APIs. But you may be wondering, what does that mean? How do we really implement that? So let me elaborate on this just a little bit more. Okay. Now, let's just say that we have a system API, and the system API is going to be a front for a rather complex backend system. I'm going to choose ExactTarget because ExactTarget is a place that can just really be a data lake of information, a data lake of data, whether the data is structured or unstructured. You can serve up a lot of data with ExactTarget, just like you can with other tools like Splunk and so on. But inside of these systems, perhaps there are lots of different types of data that your business is managing, right, or keeping. In this case, there was a lot of data from previous company acquisitions. So they put customer data, order data, product data, and they just took all this data from all these different companies that they'd acquired and put them right into ExactTarget. And so, as you can well imagine, the developers of the system API for ExactTarget, they created a system API for ExactTarget, but they served up some interesting data. What they did is they said, well, let's just go ahead and give the consumer of the system API the maximum flexibility when it comes to getting data out of ExactTarget. So we'll just say, let's give the consumer of the system API an index name and a query string. Now, the query string is not like a query string in HTTP, but in this case, the query string is like a query language for ExactTarget. So they wanted to get data out of ExactTarget, and they would use this query string, sort of like SQL in a database, right? So they would write out this rather complex query to actually get the data out of ExactTarget. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with it has pros and cons. And the pros are, of course, is that you can get, through the system API, any data out of ExactTarget that you want. But there are other tools that do the same thing. Now, the cons are, it's not easy to consume. In other words, the consumer of the system API must have intimate details of ExactTarget, must know the index names, and furthermore, must know the query language. And if the consumer of the system API doesn't have that knowledge, he's kind of stuck. He's not able to get any data out of ExactTarget. So the recommendation, therefore, is to skip that and hide those complexities. Instead of exposing the complexities of the back-end system, you want to obscure it and abstract it and replace it rather with business data. What kind of business data? Well, customer business data, information about perhaps retail stores, if that's important, employee data, product data, order data, whatever the case may be. Whatever data that you're keeping in ExactTarget, make that system API do the heavy lifting when it comes to the complexities of getting the data from that backend system. So in RAML, you might want to set something up that looks more like this. You'll want to, in RAML that defines the interface of your specification for your system API, you'll want to specify business data instead of something that would be much more complex, okay? So there we go. That's the big nugget of information with regards to system APIs, at least. Let's expose the business data and make it easy for the consumers of the system API to get at that business data without making the consumers of that system API very, very familiar with the nuance and the complexities and the idiosyncrasies of that backend system. All right? That's big tip for the system APIs. That's big tip number one. Okay, well, and in practical form, it could look like this. Let's just say we have at least the process and the system APIs for our application network and then the backend systems. Our big data repository could serve up the business data, and there's nothing that says that we can't actually have multiple system APIs, perhaps one system API for each data subject area for that particular backend system. So if we have, for example, ExactTarget, like I just explained, and it keeps lots of different kinds of data, customer data, order data, product data, employee data, you name it. It is not out of bounds to say, well, we can have a discrete system API for each subject area for that backend system. That's perfectly acceptable. All right, that's system APIs, everyone. What about process APIs? Is there anything special that we can do with process APIs? And I'm going to argue that the answer is yes. Now, in the training for MuleSoft, especially in the fundamentals course, and I must say that even in the architecture course, I didn't see a whole lot of information in those courses about how to achieve the really maximum reusability for process APIs. And so with the clients that I have and my students, I try to teach it this way. For process APIs, I like to say that the API really, the process API really is the foundation of your application network, okay? And once the foundation is firm, it's designed well, in other words, you open yourself up to a lot of opportunity for reusability. Designed poorly, it could actually be a trap, quicksand, if you will, all right? Now, I've seen organizations that do this very well and organizations that do this not so well. Let's talk about the difference between them, okay? And now, in many, many organizations, when they think about doing data integration work and how to unfold the project work, they're going to do it this way. They're going to say, well, look, we bought this great new tool that's going to help us achieve that reusability. That's MuleSoft. Let's go ahead and do some project work to see what it can do. But without a lot of forethought, this is what happens. We have project teams that start on their projects for data integration. They've been through the training, so they know about application networks. They know that they should have experience APIs and process APIs and system APIs. And what happens is that each project team creates their own variation of very common process APIs. So you probably be, I suppose it's possible, but you probably struggle to think of a project that does not in some way deal with customer data. So it stands to reason, therefore, that most, perhaps virtually all, maybe, right, projects that deal with customer data, they're going to have a customer process API in some form. Now, if you think about a big organization that's new to MuleSoft and they spin up, say, 15 or 20 project teams, then that means that all of those project teams are going to create their own version of the process API, of a customer process API. And what's the problem with that? Well, as you can see here in the diagram, it just simply leads to a lot of redundancy. And that's actually not uncommon. I see that quite a bit. And furthermore, it gets even more interesting when particular backend systems, they have to have system APIs. So each project team comes up with their own system API for that backend system. And this seems a little bit, it seems like it would be unusual, but it's very common. All right, so organizations are doing this quite a bit, especially organizations that have project teams that are delivering MuleSoft solutions. They don't have a lot of oversight from perhaps their enterprise architects. Very, very common. And so the way I like to tell my customers to test for this is to simply go to Exchange and do a search in Exchange for customers and see how many process APIs come up, right? And I did this with one of my clients, and I think I counted like 35 customer process APIs. There's just a lot of redundancy. And it's because there wasn't a lot of oversight, there wasn't a lot of planning with regards to that process API. So what I'd like to do is to help organizations go from this state to the desired state, which is that there would be a process API for each subject area. Let's talk about that. So what I'd like to talk about with my clients is that, look, and my students as well, you want to think about your process APIs in terms of a business object model. Now, those of you that are familiar with perhaps data modeling or planning out classes for business objects and that sort of thing, you'll be familiar with this diagram. And this is actually an entity relationship diagram. But in an object model, it's the same principle at least. The idea is that you have major data entities like customer, like order, like perhaps a product for your business. And if you think about those major business data entities, the process APIs that you would conceive of for your application network should resemble those data entities, or those classes, if you will. Okay, so for example, if your company deals with customer data, it's a great idea, which virtually all companies do, of course. You want to have a customer process API. And MuleSoft has done a lot of good marketing work around this idea of a single view of the customer, right? And that's one or few customer process APIs that serve up customer data. The idea is that you can overcome the redundancy that would result by simply planning out your process APIs. So if you think about process APIs as resembling your business object model, here's what you can do, right? Let's think about an application network that's perhaps a little better designed. And we want to, what I would take my customers and even my students through is this idea that, look, the first project for your application network should be, before we commission any other project work, the first one should be, let's plan out what the process APIs should be based on our business object model. Whether it's managing inventory or managing products or services or customers or retail stores or employees, those major business data entities should be reflected in the process API layer, okay? So you want to have perhaps a team of enterprise architects or whoever is in the know with regards to this sit down and actually plan out what the process APIs should be. And if not, go ahead and design them and even build them. And that really should be your first project. And then the subsequent project work would consist of creating system APIs for these backend systems, okay? Now, quick note before we continue, a little time out here. This is a bit of a parenthetical, but when you create, I think another good tip for reusability here is that when you think about creating an application network, especially the process APIs, and think about which system APIs those process APIs should consume, you want to think about getting data for your process APIs from the system APIs that are interfacing with the systems of record, and not necessarily with systems that same data is replicated to, okay? So just a quick point there, and that is just to repeat that, get the data for your process APIs from the system of record, in other words. So for example, a lot of organizations are replicating data, especially into Salesforce, okay? And it's not always the case that Salesforce is going to be the system of record for customer data. Could be, probably should be, maybe, right? It could be arguable. But when you think about the legacy systems in an organization, if the system of record for customer data is some system other than Salesforce, say, but there are projects and perhaps data integration applications that replicate data from that system of record into Salesforce, okay? Then it makes more sense to make sure that your customer, your single view of the customer, process API, gets data from the system of record instead of getting data from the other system that data is replicated to, like Salesforce, for example, right? And just use that as an example. But you just want to make sure that your process APIs are serving up that data from that system of record, not from data that's being replicated to other systems. All right, so it provides a more canonical view of the data, if you will. Okay, and then, so once we have the projects underway for understanding what our process APIs should be, we're going to plan them, design them, even build them, and we have our system API projects are underway as well. Then imagine how little time it'll take to actually create the experience APIs that are going to consume those very well thought out process APIs, okay? So this is a little bit more challenging to set up within an organization because it kind of, it goes against the culture in some ways. But if done with a very strategic view of building reusability into an application network, it can really pay some huge dividends, all right? All right, pause there. I feel like I've been talking a lot and there might be some questions. So if there are any questions, just feel free to go ahead and blurt them out. Maybe I should check chat real quick. Unread messages. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna keep my eye on the chat window here, folks, just in case you do have any questions. Do feel free. All right, now anyway, that's process APIs. Okay. Now a couple other notes about.
There's just a new question.
Please go ahead.
So Boris is saying, is C4E approach, if the C4E approach should help? Absolutely
right. The C4E approach should help. Okay. Now, various organizations have C4E organizations that are in varying stages of maturity. I've been in organizations that have a very mature C4E that understand these principles well, and others that have C4Es that are still in development, where the C4E really consists of putting out coding standards and development process standards and deployment process standards and that sort of thing, and have given really very little thought to the principles I've just conveyed. So absolutely right. The C4E, Boris, should very well be involved in this and should be guiding this effort, really. But that's not necessarily always the case. So in as much as you're able to do so, I encourage my clients to influence organizations to undertake that first project, just like I've described here, and really plan out those process APIs. Now, that's not always the case. So what I'm going to talk about in just a moment is how to recover. So let's just say that we have the siloed approach that we talked about before, but we want to get to the state where we have very well planned process APIs. So how do we go from a state of very siloed project teams that are doing their own experience process and system APIs to a more planned approach like this, where the organization can really leverage their process APIs to achieve maximum reusability? So how do we go to that bad state to the good state, if you will, right? I want to explain that in just a moment, but it really does depend on how adept the C4E team is, okay? But yeah, the C4E team should definitely be in the business of being in governance here. So Boris says, I believe API governance is the major goal of C4E. Absolutely right. So in my experience, the C4E team has allowed a lot of redundancy in, C4E teams have often allowed a lot of redundancy, and it's not necessarily necessary. if you can put it that way. Okay, so it really just does depend on the expertise of the C4E team. But anyway,
there's another question in the Q&A tab. So could you talk about that part around system of records?
Yeah, it says here, but Salesforce is the system of record. All other systems are synced with Salesforce. So Salesforce is the source of system APIs. That's often the case, but not always the case. Now remember, Salesforce, of course, is going to keep customer data, but for many organizations, Salesforce is not always the system of record for customer data. Okay, so that's important as a distinction. It's often the case that customer data is synchronized to Salesforce and also back to the system of record. Now, it's not common. It happens though. The point is that process APIs should be reading data from those systems of record and not necessarily from systems that data is synchronized to. And that's an important distinction. All right, so customer data is typically synced to Salesforce. Yes, that's right. It can be synced to Salesforce. It can also be synced back to the system of record, whatever the system of record may be. All right, and it's not always customer data. Sometimes it's order data. Sometimes it's other types of data that you put into Salesforce. So just be aware of what data your process APIs are serving up. Again, you just want to make sure that it's the system of record, the data from the system of record, okay? All right. Now, speaking of how to plan your process APIs for maximum reusability, also want to think about this, and I want to put up an excerpt from an article. This is a good friend of mine, Niall Darby. He's a MuleSoft architect, and he's written about this particular topic extensively. He put out an article, and I have the link to it here. Let me know if you want it, or go ahead and look up Niall Darby and LinkedIn. You'll find this article. But he stresses this point, and I think it's a good one. It's called domain-driven design, okay? And this is, I'm going to read it to you here. Business capabilities are best designed when their design is the result of tight collaboration between the development team and the business experts. Domain-driven design recognizes the business domain as the primary customer of the microservice. The capability expressed in its functionality in the language of the domain makes no effort to attend to the broader needs of the business as a whole. This is because each domain team will likely have different perceptions of apparently similar business data entities. So I will say that Niall is, of course, all on board with application network, but the thrust of his article here, and really the main point, and I'm going to give you a moment to read that last paragraph here in just a moment, but he's saying that, look, your application network or your APIs that you put into your application network should very deliberately support the business processes. So in other words, we don't create APIs for the sake of APIs. We don't create an application network for the sake of an application network. To achieve reusability, we want to really support those business processes. All right, so any other questions coming up here? All right, question for maximum reusability. Process APIs should resemble which? Yeah, okay, thanks. You got it. Awesome, thanks. Anyway, let me give you a moment, everybody. I'd encourage you, just take a moment, read that last paragraph, and we'll pick it up in just a moment when you're done.
There is a question that says, once an API is given, how to know whether it is a system, process, or experience API? All right.
Well, very often, once an API is created, we do two things to make sure that we understand its correct classification. One, we often give it an appropriate name. So for example, a process API will often bear the name process API in Exchange. Not always, but it's a common practice. Similarly with system APIs, when you design a system API, the name of the system API should probably include the system that the system API is interfacing, and then also the term system API or SAPI. That's one way. Another way is to keep up with the visualizer. In MuleSoft, there is a visualizer, which often helps with identifying what the process APIs are. And this is especially easy to do if the process APIs have been very well planned. Now, if the process APIs have simply been cooked up in siloed project teams, or perhaps they're just the glue that holds the system APIs together with the experience APIs with no more thought than that, it may be a little bit more difficult to determine them. But just in short, like I said, 2 ways to determine what the classification of an API is, if it's a process API, system API, or experience API. 1, by the name, that's very typical. And 2, how it actually is rendered in the visualizer. All right, so very often the architects will keep diagrams. I know for every project I deliver, I keep a diagram of the application network. I create it in Visio or some other diagramming software. And it's just a very simple box diagram like the one you see here. And it describes the application network. And I make sure that's socialized. It's linked to in exchange for the APIs that we create for it. Maybe it's in a SharePoint or something like that, whatever the case may be for that particular client, just to make sure that it's pretty well accessible to everybody. All right, does that make sense? All right, very good. Okay, so I think Darby is making Niall is making a great point here that I really appreciate his insight. We want to make sure that we're writing these APIs to support the business. We want to keep the business in the black, and that's really the point. So the more reusability we have with our application network, obviously the more in the black our employer or our client is going to be able to be with this. All right. Now let's talk about remediation. So let's just say that a customer has, or a company has done exactly what I mentioned before. They've spun up multiple project teams for MuleSoft work, and they've done all the project work in silos, and there's a lot of redundancy. How do you get to this state, from this state to a more desirable state that is conducive to reusability? Okay. I get this question a lot, and it's a great question because many companies are finding themselves in that situation, right? They commission MuleSoft projects without really much thought as to what the process APIs should be, or how to achieve reusability. And so they want to get to this end state. How do they get there? And it's simply a matter of versioning. So let me go ahead and talk about that a little bit. So let's talk about remediation for just a moment. We have a situation where the silos have existed. The project teams have done their work in silos, and there's a lot of redundancy across our process APIs, okay? Well, we want to get to the state where we have this here, right? So let me try to do a bit of an amalgam here of the old versus the new. And so what we want to do is we want to take the old approach. This is the result of that siloed approach where there's a lot of redundancy. And we want to create perhaps a new version of a customer process API, a single view of the customer, if you will, right? And it'll contain, the best of perhaps all of these process APIs that deal with customer data. And it'll understand what data it's serving up, and perhaps even improve upon it by introducing perhaps a canonical format for customer data even. But it's simply a matter of versioning. You want to create the next version, if you will, of your application network. And you can get from a state of undesirability to this desired state where there's a lot of reusability by simply creating your next version of your process APIs. So in other words, it's never too late to go ahead and plan out your process APIs based on a business object model, and then go ahead and start building the process APIs that are going to actually take you to that end state. All right, it's the same thing with the system APIs. If there's lots of redundancy, not a problem. Consolidate that redundancy, create the next version of that system API that'll replace eventually those original system APIs. All right, so your remediation project would be to create a customer process API that consolidates all of the existing redundant process APIs, and the same thing for your system APIs. You want to create the next version that will consolidate and eliminate the redundancy of your existing system APIs, okay? So it's just a kind of an easy way to take us to this next state. And then of course, you'll want to make sure that you have all of your all of your process APIs built upon that business object model, okay? All right, once an API is given, how to know, okay, got it. We already did that one. Perfect, okay, good job. Great questions, by the way. Good job, everybody. Okay, now, How about an additional tip? Here's an additional tip. And that is, again, you want to try to fight against this perception that many MuleSoft customers have, that just by opening the proverbial box to MuleSoft, they're automatically going to get reusability. That's not the case. Reusability must be designed for, it must be planned. It doesn't happen just by default, okay? I mentioned earlier on that it starts with discoverability, and then I gave you some great tips for process APIs and system APIs to help maximize reusability. But what about this one? Ask your business partners or ask your client, or maybe you would even do this yourself, to create a JIRA story regarding how API reusability would be utilized. So in other words, everybody says they want reusability, but why and how, right? So if somebody can write a JIRA story about that topic, that gives you as developers much more power and leverage to be able to design for reusability. So very often, as I mentioned before, companies start with the project work, the siloed project work, and the JIRA stories are all about take this data from this system and put it in this system, right? But if they want reusability, ask them to write a JIRA story about what it'll do for their business and how it'll be utilized. And if they can do that, I think you can go a long way towards actually planning for reusability, because actually designing and building reusability, it takes a little bit more thought and work, and therefore a little bit more time than, say, just writing a very simple point-to-point data integration. All right, point-to-point data integrations are quick. You can do them very fast. And as a matter of fact, a lot of customers, that's what they want. They want to be able to integrate systems very, very fast, but they've got some tactical goal that they've got to hit. And though it loads us to think about, sometimes point-to-point data integrations are appropriate, given the company's objective to tactically stay in the black and achieve some tactical goal. And of course, they have to realize that when they do point-to-point data integrations, they're achieving zero reusability. Of course, that has to be the caveat. That has to be the disclaimer that you give them, right? But I don't want you to shy away from point-to-point data integrations if it is in the business best interest to do that. And usually, like I said, that requires very tactical goals to keep the business in the black, okay? Definitely not a strategic goal. And I'm loath to ever recommend point-to-point data integrations, but sometimes it is practical. And it's the best solution because it can be done very, very quickly, right? But setting up an application network, it takes a little bit more time. And achieving reusability and helping the business understand how to quantify the value of that reusability. Oftentimes it starts with the JIRA story. So maybe an example of a JIRA story would be, say, line of business A will create an experience API that consumes customer and order data. Process APIs must be in place to support creation of these experience APIs. Maybe something as simple as that. But you want to help your business partners and your client, your employer, perhaps understand the value of reusability by perhaps writing a JIRA story. Okay. All right. Next one. This is one of my favorites. All of my students, they always hear me say this. Friends don't let friends write Java code, right? It's a trap. Now, it's a very common one because many, probably the majority of MuleSoft developers are former Java developers. And a lot of them have quite a bit of experience with Java and can countenance the solution to any problem with Java. And that's great, except when it keeps the developer from understanding the full scope of the tool set, okay? Now, very often, anything that you want to do in Java, you can do with an off-the-shelf connector or transformer from MuleSoft, most especially DataWeave. So I often tell this anecdote to my students. I had a client some time back who had spent quite a bit of time writing Java code for a data transformation. He spent a few weeks on it, as a matter of fact. And he was insistent that DataWeave couldn't help him. And then finally, when he hired me as a coach, reviewed his project, and that was the first thing I kind of zeroed in on. He said, look, I can't figure out how to make this transformation work. So we took a look at his Java code, and it was a few hundred lines of Java code. And I said, okay, well, let's take a look at data weave. And he said, no, I've already done data weave. I don't think it'll work. And I said, but that's okay. Let's try it again. So with a few insights into data weave, I helped him within 30 minutes. 30 minutes, we had a data weave solution for him that worked perfectly. And he had just spent a lot of time writing Java code, okay? So I understand it, that it's not always the case that you can avoid writing Java code, but I can, virtually, let me go so far as to say 90+% of all of the examples of Java code that I've ever seen in a MuleSoft project could have been done very easily with either data weave or some other transformer. And Java adds a lot of time to MuleSoft projects and a lot of cost that's perhaps unnecessary. So let me just encourage you to think twice about using Java. Don't use it, right? And definitely don't use it, especially if you can use data weave, okay? Okay, well, that's really my presentation, everybody. Those are, hopefully you found those helpful. Those are my few hints on achieving maximum reusability. So just to recap, process APIs, make sure that they resemble the business object model, right? So you want to avoid duplication in your process APIs by planning your APIs well. And perhaps that would even be the first project you would undertake. System APIs should obscure the complexities of backend systems and just serve up business data. Okay, no need to make the consumers of your system API understand the nuances of those backend systems. All right. Avoid using Java code. All right. And of course, the other items that I mentioned in the presentation were discoverability. Reusability really does start with discoverability. If you have a big audience for Anypoint Platform Exchange, and if you have your APIs registered in Exchange, you have very thoughtfully designed APIs, that's going to help with your reusability as well. And the very last point that I made just a moment ago, I actually snuck that into the presentation at the last moment, was write a JIRA story. I'm actually going through this very exercise with one of my clients right now because we're debating between some unbelievably tight timelines to deliver 19 data integrations in the next 2 weeks, if you can believe that. That's what they want to do. But they also want to have process APIs and system APIs. So I had to put the brakes on it and say, look, guys, let's think about what we're trying to achieve with the process APIs and system API approach, which is going to take a little bit more time to implement, will also yield you greater reusability. But I actually asked them today to actually write a JIRA story about what reusability is going to look like for their organization. So it really caused some good, it was very thought-provoking. So causing some good churn. And that's all I got. So thank you all for your attention. Hope that you found that's helpful, and I'd be glad to take on any questions, or if you'd like to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'd be glad to connect with you.